Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this event. My name's Julian Huppert. I'm the director of the Intellectual Forum here at Jesus College. And it's a great pleasure to have you here and to have this wonderful panel here, which I'll say a bit about in a second. We were set up in 2016 to get people to think and talk about interesting and important things here and anywhere around the world. One of the programs that we run is to support fellows conferences for some of our star academics to get them to lead on events, and this is one of those. If you are new to Jesus, you're also very welcome here. We have an amazing history that I can talk about, starting in 1144, when we were first set up as a nunnery. And it's been a place of thought for a very long time since then. And we've produced some absolutely fantastic thinkers over that time. People like Malthus, who spoke a lot about population, people like Lisa Jardine, our first female fellow, and many of the people we're going to hear from today. So this is run by two of our stunning academics. Professor Shailaja Fennell, who'll be chairing. Shailaja, professor in land economy. She's an expert in development around the world, whether we're talking about the Indian subcontinent or we're talking about the Fenlands just north of here. So she will cover the whole gamut of those. And Soumya Saxena is also one of our stars. She's been a college postdoctoral associate for a few years and has sadly just moved on to take a position back in India. But it's great to have you back here for this. I'm going to say very little, and I'm going to hand over to our wonderful panel. I think Shailaja is going to introduce everybody, and I will stay quiet. Over to you.
Thank you very much for coming today, and welcome to those of you who are online, including the first of our four speakers. I'll say a little bit about each of our speakers. Dr. Cynthia Farid is a legal historian and a lawyer at the Supreme Court of Bangladesh, and she's currently a global academic fellow at the University of Hong Kong Faculty of Law and a member of the Global Youth Academy in Germany. She unfortunately can't be with us today because she's unwell, but she is online, so you can see her. Thank you for coming despite not being well, Cynthia. We miss you, but we're delighted you'll be able to speak. Prior to this, she was previously working on law reform and policy development in Bangladesh as an international development professional. And Dr. Farid's research interests include social legal history, constitutional and administrative law, law and development with a focus on South Asia, and knowledge production processes in the global South. I'll introduce all the four speakers and then I'll say a few words and then ask them to speak. And I'm introducing them in the order that they're going to speak. So next, Dr. Atiya Sultan is a career civil servant in Pakistan Administrative Service since 2016. She served as an assistant commissioner in Islamabad, Gujarat, and Jhelum, and is additional deputy commissioner in Lahore, Pakistan. She's also worked in the provincial and federal planning commissions of Pakistan. She holds a doctorate and an MPhil from the University of Cambridge. Welcome back. And is an author of a new book, A Broken Record, Institutions, Community and Development in Pakistan, a CUP book, 2022. And I remember the brilliant conference that you organized. She also co-edited the Gazetteer of the Lahore District, Sange Meal Publications 2012. Atiyab has published academic work in leading journals such as Modern South Asian Studies, has also worked as a consultant at Oliver Wyman, London, and taught economics at Lahore. And she's currently in the US. So thank you for coming such a long distance. And then our own Dr. Soumya Saxena, who is a British Academy postdoctoral fellow, just completed that position, and is an affiliated lecturer at the Faculty of History. Her research interests include legal history, family law, gender and politics in South Asia, and her new book, Divorce and Democracy, A History of Personal Law in Post-Independence India, which also was published by CUP in 2012. CUP is getting enriched by the quality of our publications. She was interested in legal policy and has advised on the Justice Verma Commission in 2013, and I think she'll be speaking to that later. And the commission was formed in 2012 to recommend amendments to laws of sexual violence against women in India. The report became the basis for the Criminal Law Amendment of 2013. Soumya has also advised for the 21st Law Commission in India, a premier law reform organization from 2016-18, on reports relating to family law reform in India and repeal of sedition laws. In 2019, she also consulted for the Forced Marriages Commission in the United Kingdom on preventing forced and fraudulent marriages in Britain involving citizens from India. Last but not least, Elil Hu. Elil is currently a PhD student and is at Jesus College, and she researches the efficacy of climate and development policies in the Global South where she's often witnessed the ease with which women's evocative contributions to policy dialogues are dismissed as irrelevant, immaterial, or worse still, provocative, or maybe best still provocative, depending on what you see it as. Women, and especially women from the global south, she argues, were scarcely represented at stakeholder meetings, at international policy and programs, in either the definition or in the execution. Women continue to be invisible in domestic and international climate commitments. In her role as a contributing leader to strategy design, Elil has experienced the institutional expectations that require women to read and live within the social fault lines, and these same institutions that perceive forms of female agency as provocative prevent their very women from taking on roles. She's looking to finding ways of freeing climate diplomacy and policy spaces where women can be agents of change. And this requires, she argues, interrogating cultural biases and manifestations of patriarchal norms. Her work is based on a decade's experience in designing organizational strategy for climate-oriented developmental responses. And some of that is coming through in her PhD work. So thank you, all four of you. I feel honored to be speaking about these four incredibly powerful women. And I want to just give a context in which why it's important to look at young women in policy in South Asia. It's not because South Asia does not have a history of women in important positions. In fact, Sirimal Bandaranaike was the first woman prime minister in the world in 1960. There are a series of other important women who have played roles. Indira Gandhi, Benazir Bhutto, both daughters of powerful politicians in the region, in India and in Pakistan. And most recently, of course, Sheikh Hasina, who is currently heading Bangladesh. Before her, Khalida Zia, and for a short time, Myanmar, which at the center of South Asian studies, we certainly include that in the region, Aung San Suu Kyi. So it's not the absence of women in the higher echelons of political life. But what is new and what is this generation of incredibly powerful young women are representing is changing the policy space. So it's not about elite women, but it's in the democratization of the role of women across these countries. So without further ado, Cynthia, if I could invite you, Dr. Farid, to make your presentation.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. I was, in fact, really looking forward to this event. And I told Soumya, I really wished I could be there in person, but no South Asian event is complete without a little blip along the way, if only to demonstrate the resilience of South Asians when it comes to crisis management. So I'm incredibly grateful to Soumya and the organizers for working extra hard to connect me remotely. I look forward to engaging with the other panelists. I come from a legal background, so I will approach this topic from the perspective of lawyers in Bangladesh in the policy arena. Now, I think it's fair to say that lawyers can be instrumental in changing policy through recourse to courts. I want to give our audience a sense of numbers in this landscape of lawyers in Bangladesh. Now, these numbers are close approximations. The Bar Council of Bangladesh and other institutions generally do not publish disaggregated data. So in terms of the Supreme Court, there's approximately 15% women amongst the bar. The subordinate or trial courts, we actually don't have figures for the bar, but they do exist. I just don't have them. The subordinate or trial courts have around 1,900 judges. Approximately 1/3 or just over 500 of these women are judges. And the Supreme Court, which is the apex court, and where the total number of judges average between 100, women judges have been no more than between 5 and 7, so still single digits in terms of percentage. Now, like many other South Asian jurisdictions, family lineage helps, and often top judges of the Supreme Court, top female judges of the Supreme Court, do come from legal families. Again, this is not historically uncommon in South Asia. We know that social and political capital are both connected to family legacies, and so an aspiring female lawyer without those connections will have to navigate significant challenges. I do want to plug in a disclaimer here. The courtroom is an incredibly performative space, and often advocacy calculations of which lawyer to put forward before which bench of judges will be based on a variety of speculative factors, like judicial preferences based on past record, which lawyer may be able to hold the judge's attention for longer than 10 minutes, and so on and so forth. Now, another issue that female lawyers have to contend with is client confidence. And again, that could be influenced by similar factors. Family lineage is probably top of the list, and whether the lawyer in question has foreign degrees and credentials and so on and so forth. Which then now brings me to academia and direct policy spaces. So legal academia, the approximate number there, female representation, is approximately 30%. Between the legal profession and academia, you have a third category of in-house consultants and or lawyers who work for development agencies or NGOs who have a much more direct impact on policy. Now, in the context of Bangladesh, again, I have no data, but in this policy space, women seem to be much more visible. This is also a safer diversion from an otherwise often impenetrable legal profession. But there's also a performative aspect here too, which is that there is significant interaction with state actors, right? So if you work in the development sector, you're considered your development partner is the government. And so you have to deal with state actors day in and day out. And that relationship is also, again, defined by leveraging credentials, which could be your degree, which could be your affiliation with a donor agency. But the work that you do, you operate as a local informant. You write the policies, often without any acknowledgement. There is a distinct hierarchy between an international expert and a local expert who informs policies. And this segregation, coupled with general job insecurity of the sector, which is heavily dependent on external funding, can induce intense competition among local staff. And this can also translate into outwardly sexist behavior in the workplace. So looking forward, I'll keep it short. First of all, numbers are essential. We just don't have the data, and we don't have disaggregated data on top of that. Many of the legal institutions don't collect or publish that data, and neither do international organizations, which are often entrusted to reform those legal institutions. And international organizations also don't self-report. So representation is essential, but not just to enable entry of women into the profession or the policy arena, but also to ensure justice for women on a number of issues, including, for example, justice in issues other than violence. Now, justice for women, and I think it's true of other places in South Asia, that justice for women has been relegated to the realms of violence. The argument for other grounds tend to get muted. So contrast cases of outright violence with economic justice or parity. Now, certain issues in Bangladesh where this comes up is labor relations and or the criminalization of debt. So women are not decision makers in families, but are held responsible for debts of their male guardians. Now, a male judge would need, to use a development jargon which I loathe personally, is sensitization. A male judge would need sensitization. A female judge may not, or maybe less so. So I'll end my comments here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You're most welcome to come back in if you have more to say, because we did allocate up to 20 minutes for each speaker. So if you did feel that you wanted to, but we are aware that both you're online, but also you're unwell. So thank you very much, but don't feel that you don't have a second chance if you want to come back in after the others have spoken, if you'd like to. Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much. If there's a burning question that you have for a particular speaker, we will stop and take them after each presentation. Otherwise, I'd like each of the speakers to give you the richness of their own experiences, and then maybe we can use the final half hour to do that conversation, if that's okay. So, Dr. Sultan, over to you. Oh, maybe I'll go and sit there so that we don't drop the screen.
Okay.
20 minutes, you'll see hand go up.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending this panel discussion today. I must thank the organizers, Professor Fennell, Dr. Huppert, and Dr. Saxena, and Jesus College, Cambridge, for putting this event together. I'm looking forward to learning much from our conversation today. My own contribution to the panel will revolve around discussing three aspects of female participation in the policy and public affairs in South Asia. And the specific context is the civil service of Pakistan. For short, I will call them the what, how, and why. The first of these, the what, will detail some of the facts and developments regarding women in the civil service in Pakistan. The second, the how, will discuss some of the mechanisms and processes that enable the same. And lastly, the why will revolve around a discussion of some of the beliefs underpinning the same that create a tension between favorable policies and actual outcomes. Since the 1970s, when the first women were recruited in the civil service in Pakistan, the numbers have been rising constantly. In my batch, for instance, 45% of the recruitment was female, so in a batch of about 250. Alongside, there has been an increasing thrust towards improving the conditions and policies related to women. Favorable policies include an increase in maternity leave, building of daycares and office premises, bathrooms and other amenities for women, and so on. Many of these changes have been initiated and supported by female officers, but some of them have also been initiated by male officers. Even so, inequalities persist. Most women in the civil service continue to prefer desk jobs instead of field roles. Many are reluctant to even apply for benefits like maternity leave, as they are perceived as unprofessional or not hardworking enough if they avail those. Sexual and other forms of harassment are also common, and there are other inequalities, including soft forms of discrimination and exclusion that they experience every day. I will now talk about some of the dynamics or the how of female representation in the civil service. The civil service is largely seen as a dignified and respectable profession by many in Pakistan, and so there is a lesser hesitation in actually sitting the exams and letting women join the service. At the same time, women legislators have been at the forefront of enacting laws that increase the representation of women at different levels of the service and also provide facilities like childcare, maternity leave, etc. to them. Donor programs continue to have gender sensitivity in their programming, and government is incentivized to increase female representation and participation broadly. However, despite the enactment of some favorable policies and the increasing representation of women in the public service, this is a period of transition with much tension for the female bureaucrats. And this is reflected in the type of roles that are actually assigned to them. One way in which this occurs is that while women are represented, they don't necessarily always have authority or decision-making roles. Instead, they're expected to perform their jobs in a passive or compliant manner. Women do not feel they can utilize the beneficial policies because they're seen as not committed enough to their profession if they do so, especially in a bureaucracy that is based on inputs and visibility instead of competence and contribution. Secondly, they're unwittingly excluded from many informal opportunities for networking and relationship building, including old boys clubs. This is particularly significant when they face a crisis of any sort. Thirdly, and quite importantly, there is an intersectionality associated with being a female and a bureaucrat. So every challenge that a male civil servant may face is exacerbated in the case of women, and they have fewer social resources to use to help them navigate the situation. Consequently, honest women end up being penalized more. They can be harassed more, and official life can be made difficult by burdening them with more undesirable or onerous duties. Now, going back to the fact that women are increasing in number, one expectation that can form from this trend is for there to be greater solidarity and sisterhood among women. However, from interviews with female bureaucrats themselves, I have learned that their worst experiences are sometimes associated with other female officers. In the case of officers more senior to them, this is about the seniors wanting them to suffer too, instead of wanting everything on a platter. Even otherwise, envy can lead to a lack of collegial support. This may seem trivial, but it is an important social dynamic in the bureaucracy where the impetus to pull others down can triumph over even the urge to do one's own job well. And it is related to a host of other dynamics within the bureaucracy where honest work is anyway difficult to perform, even for a male officer. Being a woman in that environment is therefore associated with a double whammy. Your presence itself is accepted begrudgingly. If you then raise a voice over some set patterns in the office, you will quickly face resistance. As a result, many women can actually accede more easily in order to retain their positions. Finally, I will talk about some of the reasons why these dynamics persist. While formal rules and procedures lead to greater representation of women in the bureaucracy, the beliefs that are held more widely within the system have not updated as fast. Some of these beliefs that hinder the progress of women include patriarchy or an inherent belief in the greater suitability of male officers for official positions, especially those entailing a greater role in the field. A second such belief is the idea that the primary role of women is to care and nurture, not to perform aggressive seeming roles. So even at work, they will be appointed to more caretaking type of responsibilities and not expected to confront. The administrative service and the police service were some of the last to have greater representation of women because of this, as they often entail public-facing roles, late hours, dealing with protests, law and order, crime, and so on. Yet another belief is that women are not competent for sensitive roles, which is something I faced in my last posting, for instance, in law and order or intelligence. And finally, there's a belief in the mendacity of the system itself. It is not meant to be a meritocratic system and does not reward merit or competence and instead revolves around personal gain. So every action of female bureaucrats, even if legal and upheld by the law, is met with the regressive beliefs that have not updated. Hence, women continue to face resistance in the exercise of their duties. They also continue to be socially excluded from any opportunities of career growth and networking. Finally, this is all reflective of the unstable balance that women maintain as they continue to be dominantly responsible for care roles at work and at home. The last point that I will make is the unwillingness of women themselves to change some of these beliefs and patterns. In this regard, I'll just give two examples. In the first one, in 2021, I was posted in Islamabad and tasked with organizing an event relating to increasing awareness regarding gender-based violence. We had funding from an international donor for the event. Now, this type of activity is fairly common and often used to fulfill the requirements of some loan or other assistance taken from an international organization. But it achieves little by talking to a room full of women about the statistics and basic discourse around gender-based violence. A friend of mine, not from the civil service, suggested that we host the event in a public park frequented by women and men and actually have a male-only audience because, to quote her, they are the ones needing awareness. I thought her idea was great and it was novel and it would actually update at least some part of the population. But it was quickly shot down as being too quirky. So we ended up with an audience of women. Similarly, in recent years, donors have been quick to support gender protection centers in Pakistan, but they are paper tigers with no authority to even register a police case. So if a woman wants to register any case in a police station, she still has to go through the same hostile and unwelcome environment offered by the police that often ranges from victim blaming to openly telling her to reconcile with an abusive husband. But in the circle of donors and officers, a kosher form of superficial reform has been found. To conclude, while there is increasing representation of women in the civil service and favorable policies towards them too, tightly held social beliefs continue to make their actual work experience quite difficult. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadia. Everyone is being extremely good. I think we're all going to get a second chance to put in more material, but thank you very much for that presentation. I'd like now to invite Dr. Saxena to make her presentation.
So I can take up the leftover time.
Oh, okay. No, you can't. You can have your 20 minutes.
Okay, so today I'm going to talk about two commissions that I was a part of. Not so much the Forced Marriages Commission, because that was an initiative in the UK, and this is more about policy in South Asia. So the first commission was something that, that this was a moment of great it became a moment of great global importance for the Indian women's movement, because it was formed, the Verma Commission was formed in the aftermath of the very brutal Delhi gang rape case, where a 23-year-old woman was gang raped and murdered. Eventually, she didn't survive. She didn't survive the assault, and that became an incident that saw a lot of media attention, almost a disproportionate amount of media attention, because this kind of an incident is not rare. Such brutality has happened before, but something about this incident and about the fact that the victim here was also, it really hit home with the middle class sensibilities in India. And therefore, what we saw in the aftermath of this incident was a very spontaneous protest, which was a very almost also an urban protest, but an urban protest which was very akin to a Reclaim the Night campaign that we've all heard of, which was very spontaneous, where a bunch of, not just a bunch, but huge numbers of women, I'll try and put out a picture here in a bit, huge numbers of women and men gathered in an area in Delhi, very central part of Delhi, the India Gate area. And they sat down with a candlelight vigil. There were spontaneous protests occurring in different tier 2 cities that kind of spun out of the main protest. And the victim here was renamed Nirbhaya, because of course for privacy reasons her name wasn't revealed. But once the incident was reported, Nirbhaya in Hindi literally translates to fearless. And that's why this kind of became something that really caught public imagination. And I wouldn't say that this was like the highest point of the Indian women's movement, because Indian women's movement has been extremely, sort of boisterous, and they've prompted a lot of legal reforms. But this particular moment was a moment of public anger. And as a consequence of that, the government was very quick to respond to this incident, and also how much it was reported globally. It really made India look bad. And therefore, a lot of the government response to this incident was about redeeming what the situation of women in India is and what the world kind of believes about Indian women. And I happened to be in this commission, where we were a part of a 15-member team assisting 2 judges and a senior lawyer. And only one of them survives now, Mr. Gopal Subramaniam, who was the senior lawyer. Justice Verma was, again, one of the very, few liberal judges in India, and Justice Leela Seth. So she was also one of the leading Supreme Court lawyers, and both the leading Supreme Court judges, and both Justice Verma and Leela Seth had retired by this point. And this commission really became a conversation about legal reform, not just limited to sexual assault, but spoke of sex education, spoke about what the root of the problem is, spoke about how law imagines punishment, what would create deterrence, what would prevent sort of cases of recidivism where you punish, but the crime is repeated because the offenders are, sort of let go. And as a consequence of this, they wanted to make this into also a democratic movement, because this was coming out of, public protest, literally. There was an email address that was set up. And of course, people could also send us postcards, and they could send us letters to the commission office to sort of gauge public opinion. But there were about 80,000 emails that I remember we were confronted with. And by the end of it, it seemed really futile to go through them, because a lot of them just asked for very brutal forms of punishment, because that is the discourse of how we deal with crimes against women in India. It's about death penalty. It became about, public hanging of these individuals, because it really was about public anger, but it's also a little bit about a woman's honor. So a woman's honor was what really offended the public at large, and which is why a lot of that anger was about increasing punitive action and death penalty to rapists and, chemical castration, physical castration, all of these suggestions. Some of them were just like one-line emails, literally saying you should have death penalty, you should reduce the age of the Juvenile Justice Act, because one of the 5 perpetrators was one of the 5 people convicted was a minor. He was 17. And they said, just for this incident, you should reduce the age of the Juvenile Justice Act so that we can actually punish this person, this individual. And then there were reports about how the youngest was the most brutal and so on and so forth. But all of this to basically say that there was a lot of conversation around punitive action. And what the Verma Commission report did was, because it was relying on what actually creates deterrence, they found studies that actually said that increase in punishment doesn't necessarily create deterrence. What we need is surety of punishment and not severity of punishment. And that's why they ended up recommending against death penalty for gang rape. Now, one of the major reasons why they recommended against death penalty, particularly for gang rape, was because in a situation of gang rape, when more than one individual is involved, it is very difficult for the courts to convict 5 or 6 people or more than one person and give them death penalty. Very often what this leads to is the court sort of trying to read into the mitigating circumstances, read the situation in a way that they don't have to give death penalty to 5 people. Courts are hesitant to give it. And which is why what the commission had recommended was that you give, life imprisonment, increase the kind of number of years you'll be doing in jail, but do not introduce death penalty. Now, this commission was set up for exactly 1 month, and death penalty, the lack of death penalty was just one small aspect of it. It spoke about sex education. It spoke about sensitizing the police, because the police kind of work with this narrative that most cases of sexual assault are fake and women are doing it for all sorts of reasons. So it recommended, literally things like street lights in the night so that women can go out, all women buses, all women public transport, so on and so forth. But really the most focus of the amendment that followed in 2013 was only on criminal law, and not so much on everything else that was kind of addressing the root of the problem. And what the 2013 amendment therefore ended up doing was it did give death penalty for gang rape. And that's where the law currently is. Now, in this commission, there was a lot that, for me personally, because, I was also one of the youngest members to be in that commission, for me, it was a real learning experience, because we also, looked at low rates of conviction, why death penalty doesn't work. We looked at, we had recommended things like remove the marital rape exception. I want to open this up just a little bit, because this was a conversation on literally increasing the punishment for rape, for sexual assault. But marital rape is something that remains an exception within Indian law. So if a woman is married to someone, she can't report rape. She can report domestic violence, and rape is very often built into the domestic violence law, so you can report it that way, but it literally carries a marital rape exception. So the commission had recommended that we get rid of this. It had recommended that we introduce different kind of amendments to abortion law. We get rid of this colonial legislation called restitution of conjugal rights, which we inherited from the British, which was about literally a man can take a woman to court for being unwilling to consummate a marriage, and that would be called restitution of conjugal rights. And Indian women's movement has periodically kind of protested and petitioned for this provision to go away, but it has survived everything, and it survived even the Verma Commission report recommendations, and it's still there on the statute. So we still have restitution of conjugal rights. And among other sort of suggestions, the only persevering one remained that the criticism of the commission really was that it did not reduce the age of the Juvenile Justice Act, and it did not give death penalty for gang rape, which the amendment did end up doing. Now, this is something quite telling about how the Indian law responds to the women's question. So this is also, I'm glad Cynthia has already kind of mentioned it, the real conversation ends up becoming only about violence, and therefore it really satisfies the public conscience when we increase the number of years of punishment or give death penalty or something of that sort, right? So there is a protest, and then there is a commission, and there is immediately an amendment, and the time difference between protest to petition to a new amendment is barely 8 months. Right? Yet the amendment that comes into place, there's too much of a distance between what was originally demanded and what was ultimately decided, right? So one of the things that really strikes me about policy in South Asia is that a lot of what these commissions do is they become the parking lot of reform. So they will absorb social protest, convert the social protest to the legal register, provide an amendment, and the states decides to really temper it down, do whatever they like with it, but that takes away public anger. And that is why South Asia is very, very, India in particular, is very, very good at enacting new laws. And periodically you see every time there's a protest, we have the best laws on sort of abortion. It's not really a problem if one wants to abort, even in their, sort of 22nd or 24th week of pregnancy in certain special circumstances. But like an Indian feminist had once said, pro-choice is anti-women in India. And she said this because the instance of female feticide is so high that the minute you give women the choice to abort, most of the abortions will end up being sex selective, right? It's not because women are protesting forced motherhood. It's because people don't want women. They don't want girls. They don't want female babies. And as a consequence of that, now the Indian law has also made it illegal to find out the sex of the child before they're born. But nevertheless, there are strange sort of ways of doing it where the doctor can sort of give it away. And once you're aware, you can sort of opt into that sort of an abortion. And it's very, very legal and common in India. Similarly, the maternity leave laws are also fairly liberal. We get like 6 months, and there are all these sort of sexual harassment at workplace laws, which the Verma Commission also sort of contributed to. But very often that's not really addressed, sexual harassment at workplace and the preference for a male employee. That still remains, that still perseveres. So all of this to basically say that the aim of the commission may have been to institute more long-term reforms around sex education, but that becomes the last thing that the state responds to because sex education is not popular. But death penalty is popular. It takes care of public anger. And that's why the whole petition, protest to petition, petition to amendment is a very quick path in Indian politics. They have the best laws, but very poor context in which these laws operate. I also want to talk a little bit about the law commission that I became a part of. So, sorry, one more, the last point I'll make about this. So in the aftermath of the Verma Commission, it was also recommended that we undertake police sensitization training and all sorts of things. So we were speaking to, police officers, gatherings of police officers, and we were talking about how there should be a female police constable every time you make arrest after dark, and this woman constable should be there if you're arresting another woman. So there are certain protections that the law kind of builds into the procedures of arrest, just to make sure there is no sort of custodial crime that takes place at the hands of the police officer against women they're arresting or harassing and all sorts of things. And when we were doing these police sensitization programs, it became really obvious that the police genuinely believed that most cases of sexual assault in India are fake. And why do they believe this? Because there is a thin line between seeking strong laws against sexual harassment, and speaking more generally about sex negativity, speaking more generally about moral policing. So the minute we say sexual harassment laws are to be super strict, what that ends up meaning is that there is also a degree of moral policing that comes with it. So the questions that get asked to women is not so much that, what happened to you, but what were you wearing? What were you doing there? What time of the day was it when this happened with you? And that narrative doesn't change because the police is still kind of more concerned with how to build this narrative of why was the woman out there to begin with, rather than really speaking of because there is so much sex negativity and moral policing associated with, sort of women being out late at night. The other reason why police believes that most of the cases that women register are fake is because sometimes they are fake in circumstances where a consenting couple has decided to elope or be together, and the parents of one of, let's say it's an interreligious marriage or an intercaste marriage, or a couple where, the castes just simply don't agree and there is no parental approval. Very often, the parent will go and file a case of kidnapping or rape against their daughter's lover, and that would eventually be falsified because the woman would claim that, I did this voluntarily. And that then again feeds into this almost a really, devious statistic, which says that most cases of sexual assault are false. But actually, this is the content of the false cases, that it's the parents who are kind of morally policing their children, and their disapproval takes the form of a kidnapping complaint in a local police station. I'll now move on to my experience in the Law Commission. Now, Law Commission was not a consequence of one major event. So Verma Commission was like an aberration. This incident happened and the commission was set up, and then subsequently there was an amendment. But the Law Commission is fairly well instituted. It's under the Law Ministry, and it's a non-statutory body, but it's existed since 1830s. Under colonial India, it was first instituted, and what it's meant to do is recommend potential laws. It had a far wider an ambit during colonial India, where it was literally directly informing the law. Law Commission post-independence had a 3-year term. Every 3 years there would be a new law commission that's formed, and this would be generally headed by a retired judge or a jurist, and they would then be responding to questions of law, where they would simply be addressing a minor point of the law where there is confusion, or if a particular court case has highlighted a particular problem in law, the Law Commission would come in and address it. Now, 2016 is when I finished my PhD here, which was broadly on family law. It was on personal law systems in India post-independence. Personal law is a complex terrain in India, but it's basically family law. But there are multiple statutes that govern it. There are religious statutes. So depending on what religion one might be, your marriage, divorce, adoption, inheritance would be governed by religious personal law. But there are also civil law statutes that you could opt into. So you could opt into the Special Marriage Act, and subsequently your children will come under the civil law that is in India. So these jurisdictions kind of exist simultaneously, which makes Indian family law very, very complex. So this Law Commission in 2015, it was set up, and I joined in 2016, was set up to specifically look at reform of family law and recommend a uniform civil code. And a uniform civil code was meant to replace these different religious personal law codes and introduce a common sort of a code that governs all religions. Now, on paper, this seems like a great idea, but there is a great amount of sort of, politics here to be understood, which is that the Indian government, which is currently the Hindu nationalist political party, has been invested in a uniform civil code more for reasons of Hindu homogenization, which it's often accused of, and has very openly claimed and campaigned. So, but also it is very, very directed against Muslim personal law. So it's almost like the entire narrative on Indian family law is to make Muslim personal law seem extremely obscurantist compared to Hindu law, which has been relatively codified. And therefore, the argument for a uniform civil code is very loaded. It's not simply about reform. So the other thing about policy in India and women in policy in India is that gender is an extremely important important entry point into this conversation on policy, but it will never remain about women itself. It will become a conversation about secularism. It will become a conversation about religion, Hindu majoritarianism. It will become a conversation about democracy. But the entry point of it will always be, oh, we're doing it for women. We're doing it for women's rights, right? So gender is only an entry point into the big policy debate in India, which will often take some other form eventually. So in this particular case, we were given the mandate to come up with, to assess the feasibility of a uniform civil code. We assessed it, we said it's unfeasible, and instead came up with a consultation paper, which was meant to be a report on family law reform. Now, this paper on family law reform went against government policy. So here is when we have to understand the institutional politics here, because the Law Commission report went against government policy. Not only were there pressures to not release it as a report, it ultimately came out as a consultation paper, and now is really difficult to even find on the Law Commission's website. But more importantly, this paper did not make it to any legislative debate, because the idea of Law Commission reports is that they would recommend something that would eventually go to the legislature, and that's how they are converting social protest to the legal register. They're writing out amendments for the parliament to consider. In this case, nothing really happened. And it just so happened that at this moment in 2016, 17, and 18, the country is literally obsessed with family law. There is a major case in the Supreme Court of India, which is about Muslim personal law, and in particular, one practice of Muslim personal law, which is called triple talaq, or instantaneous divorce, where a man can simply say the word divorce 3 times over, and that would become a legal moment. That would affect the divorce, right? And this Muslim woman has gone and challenged this practice in court in 2017. 2018, Law Commission is holding its consultations to sort of look at recommendations around Muslim personal law. 2019, the government comes up with a new act on Muslim personal law. What are women doing across these institutions? How are they navigating these? Do I have time still, Shailaja?
5 minutes.
Okay, so so this is the last bit I'll say, and maybe I'll conclude when we are having the conversation later. So this was really interesting for me to see, because in the Supreme Court, there were these 2 organizations who were leading the conversation on triple talaq, and they sort of self-identify as the Indian Muslim Women's Movement. The Bharatiya Muslim Mahila Andolan literally translates to that, and another collective which is called the Bebak Collective, or the Fearless Collective, which was also the petitioner in this triple talaq case. So in Supreme Court, you're required to take 2 sides. So women's politics was about organizing on either, against triple talaq or in favor of the essential practice of triple talaq, or questioning whether it's essential to Islam or not, right? So in this case, they ended up with the same side as the central government, because the central government was also opposing this practice of instant divorce. But before the Law Commission, because the court requires you to sort of function in this binary, before the Law Commission, that binary completely breaks down. They consult with the Law Commission as though they're actually in a position to initiate reform. So that conversation, the tonality, it completely changed to them actually saying that, no, we don't want a uniform civil code. We actually want you to codify Muslim personal law separately. So they're basically, women are deploying different strategies across different forums to get to certain ends. So the strategy before Law Commission was literally to get some idea of a reform in a legislative form, which would be forwarded to Parliament. Now, Parliament, on the other hand, did the complete opposite. It didn't take into account the judgment or the Law Commission report, and went and criminalized the practice of triple talaq. Now, it might look like it's all headed towards getting rid of this terrible practice, but there are fine, subtle, but very important differences. It's one thing to say that this practice of instant divorce is invalid. It's quite another to say that it's criminal. If it's invalid, it's kind of like saying the marriage is allowed to subsist, which is what women had wanted. They had wanted marriages to subsist. They had wanted the triple talaq pronunciation to not mean anything. But the minute you criminalize it, it becomes something that comes with punitive action, where your neighbor who doesn't get along with you could also say that, oh, I heard him say it. You again make pronunciation into a legal moment, which the Supreme Court had done away with. So these are the kind of complexities that kind of inform the personal law debate, where even in my own experience in court, we were kind of, as a non-lawyer, I was pushed into this visitors gallery where we had to listen to everyone, but and kind of just catch on to the words that the judges were saying, because it was all, It was a really packed court. Whereas in the Law Commission, where you have the seat on the table, you realize that even the organizations you're consulting have a seat on the table. That conversation completely changed. And when the criminal law amendment came, when triple talaq got criminalized, all of these organizations actually took a position against the government policy, right? So different institutions, very different kind of politics that women are doing. And their presence is not what's in question, because now India has also enacted the Women's Reservation Bill. So it's not the presence that's going away. India is very, very comfortable with having conversations about gender, but the outcome and the original demand, there is too much of a distance between them. So if they were demanding that triple talaq be made invalid, it was in fact criminalized, right? So actually, it seems like it's really a jurisdiction that's responding to women's protest, but it's sometimes doing things that align much more with majoritarian politics. There is a lot more to say, but I will stop now, and I hope there are questions where I.
Thank you, Soumya. Thank you very much. Thank you. There will be time for questions. As I said, we can probably ask some questions, and there'll be questions from the floor as well. Last but not least, Elil, over to you. You're going to talk to us about the post-conflict situation in Sri Lanka and how that has affected the way in which women are present, but they're not heard.
If it's okay, I'll just
yes,
stay seated.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, it's really hard to follow up on these really thought-provoking and very complex conversations we've already had. But I would like to talk a little bit about Sri Lanka, which historically has actually appeared to have a very strong political and policy environment for women. As Shailaja already mentioned, we had the first female prime minister in the entire world in the 60s. We have women's participation in parliament encoded in our legislature with a 25% quota and different quotas at every level of the government apparatus. And there's a lot of reasons for women's participation being so heavily valued when it comes to the policy space. For example, we have a 99% literacy rate among women. Women are in universities at higher numbers than ever. You know, it just really looks great. But this is really a narrative that we tell ourselves when you look deeper at what it's like to be in policy or politics as a woman in Sri Lanka today. You'll see that it's actually not as shiny as we like to say. If you look at, for example, even parliament, even though we do have this 25% quota, we've never had more than 7% of these spots filled by women. And today it's only at 5%. We've only ever had 2 women in a cabinet appointed position in our entire history. There are no women, when you think about it on the broad, I should say like a statistically insignificant number of women in policy and politics in Sri Lanka today. A lot of this, I personally feel, is tied to the way violence is enacted against women. And that's really what I want to talk about today, is how there is this pernicious and insidious level of violence that's really across the culture and across the politics and across the militarization of politics in Sri Lanka. So when you look at how women are, and I'll do this by looking at it at the broad scale level of, you know, overall politics and policy in Sri Lanka, and then I look at it in one sector, which is agriculture, which is where my thesis has really been as a PhD student, and then I'll talk about it for myself personally as well, which may probably be the least interesting part of my talk today. But when you do look at, so when you come to the policy sphere, one of the things that it requires is for you to take on a public position. And when you are in the public eye, it becomes a lot easier to be targeted by violence, whether it's being sexualized, whether it's being, you know, harassed by the military and the police, like how the way society has been structured to be violent towards women becomes the first part of policy that you experience as a woman as well. When you look at the election period in Sri Lanka, it is very, very, very militarized. We've had 30 years of conflict, and the militarization of the public space in Sri Lanka has never really disappeared. You find the military involved in everything from monitoring election booths to who is what's the word? When you have an entourage as somebody who is a political person, it's not the police, but it's the military that follows you everywhere. And if you're a minority, you're still viewed suspiciously. You have to constantly prove that you're not a terrorist. Even like decades later, I myself am a minority, and I even still today very often am told that I'm a terrorist just for being Tamil, even though I have like zero inclinations to violence or policy anyways. But it's things like this that it's really very encoded in how you are viewed as an individual in Sri Lanka. It stems from this history of violence, and then it is enforced through mechanisms of violence. And I mentioned the military, but then there's also cultural levels to it, where sexual harassment is incredibly high in Sri Lanka. 98% of women have experienced some form of sexual harassment in their lifetime. 40% of women who are of a working age have considered not working because of the exposure to sexual violence in public transportation. Speaking for myself, I was not even in middle school the first time I was sexually harassed. It's so common, and it's something that you turn a blind eye to. Very often, if you try to speak about it, it's like, oh, well, that's just who boys are. That's just how society is. Why were you there in the first place? And as somebody who is a prepubescent girl, you learn at a very, very young age not to be seen in public because it is a very insecure space. And that translates once you become an adult as well, because you don't want to be in the public eye because it exposes you to violence. We, in the last decade, have had 2 women in parliament who were previously public figures already, and then that translated into sort of a political momentum for themselves. And they often have memes about them that are incredibly sexualizing. If their sari is worn or it slips in a certain way, then it immediately becomes a meme, and it's really disgusting. Or you take a selfie, and no matter how good you feel when you take that selfie and post it publicly, once you start seeing really derogatory comments, or it becomes a meme, it takes away the agency of just being a woman or being someone who is in public. So at the very high level, you see very different types of violence that are enacted towards you if you are a woman that's in a public space, let alone one that is a professional, policy-oriented space. And women do approach the space very cautiously. The third thing is, despite having legislator, it's very often that these positions are actually just sort of controlled still by the men. So I'll give a very specific example. In the last election, when it was a requirement that policies put forward a certain number of women candidates for election, there was a report by the Election Commission where it showed that oftentimes the women that were being put forward were not actually candidates themselves, but it was just like a photocopy of somebody's ID who may not even be in the country, or somebody's wife. And so the actual person who would enact in that position would be the husband or father of somebody who has just been put forward by a political party. So it's very performative, and it's not really intended to really follow the spirit of the law, even if it does follow the letter of the law. So in the public space, you see that there are very few women. There are many reasons for why women are not really present in these policy spaces. And I put forward that is really related to the violence against women, although there are, of course, many other reasons as well. And now if we look specifically at the agriculture sector, which is really heavily male-dominated, but in Sri Lanka, there are 30% of farms are actually led by women, which is really high for the region. It's really high for many regions, actually, to have 30% of farms being operated by women. And yet, when you look at these larger scale policies, women are completely absent. When you look at the agricultural policy, there are no gender-specific requirements or support provided to women farmers, because it's assumed that women are not farmers. Again, it's a public space, it's outdoors, it's, you know what I mean? It's like not something that the broad narrative accepts as being a woman's role. And it's just completely missing. When you look at the International Climate Accord, in agriculture, commitments that Sri Lanka has made, again, women are completely missing. The absence of women in these policies are directly attributed to the fact that women are not able to promote or create space in policy for themselves. And this is not because of women's own capacities, of course, but it's really about the culture and the policy environment that women would be operating in. Were they able to participate in these mechanisms that exist at the state level? And when you look at how do women operate then without these policies to support or protect them, fairly marvelously, I would argue. If you look at the east coast of Sri Lanka, there are over 800 women who farm organic produce on a weekly level. And they have these economies of scale. They have these networks that really function to create the largest organic market in Sri Lanka. And these women are entirely unsupported by the state mechanism at a policy level. There are, of course, resources that they can access, but it is, of course, harder for women to access these resources, despite which they're able to really successfully farm organically and climate smart. Wow, I lost my train of thought, but yes, they're able to really do it. I'm losing it even more. But they're really excellent at being farmers. Let's just leave it at that. And now when it does come though to climate change, the issue is that, you know, what we understand the environment to be today is not how it will be 50 years from now or 20 years from now. If you look at Jaffna, which is where I'm from, it's the driest zone of Sri Lanka. 15 years from now, it would not be possible to work outdoors because of how hot it's supposed to be, how dry it's supposed to be. What does that mean for women who are farmers? You would not be able to work outside in the daytime without the threat of exhaustion, dehydration, heat stroke, death even. So does that mean women are supposed to abandon what is their traditional source of livelihood? Where does it leave women? The state, without the policies to understand how this is impacting women, how it's impacting the region, does not have support to provide, to train, to adjust, adapt to climate change, specifically for women who are farmers. And I think that is ultimately, even if at the larger scale, it seems so theoretical or it seems so too big to really handle, when it comes down to it, everyday women are affected by the lack of women who are involved in policy and politics at the larger level. Then coming down to it just from personal anecdote, as I mentioned before, you know, like the sexual harassment, the way women are viewed in public has been really painful. I myself am not someone who engages in the policy in like public very openly because I have learned at a young age that it's a dangerous space and it can be quite painful to be a part of anything that's seen. However, a lot of my work does involve working with people at higher levels, sometimes in public forums. And it does come with the idea that in order to do this, I need to have a thick skin. And I'm trying not to use this as my therapy session for the week, but I just, you know, it's really hard to learn, someone like me who finds it very difficult to be seen in the public, to develop that thick skin, to be able to work with men who look at you and just say, well, you know, what are you doing here? Why do you care about agriculture? Why do you care about policy? Where's your dad? Who's your dad? You know, all these questions that come with it. It's always, it definitely gives you the impression that, or gave me the impression that I'm not really a part of this space. I'm not particularly welcome. And if I am seen, that there is a violent consequence to it. And you do come to find ways to navigate it. You find ways of support within the system to be a part of this space. However, it doesn't leave you, it's not necessarily as easy as it would be for, you know, people of different profiles, whether it would be someone who can speak the majority language, or perhaps someone who is part of the majority religion, or if you're a man. There are definitely people who find it easier, but at the end of the day, I think it's definitely worthwhile finding those support mechanisms, you know, like even Samia organizing this, I think is such a valuable conversation to have about what does it mean to be a woman who's in policy, and then finding those spots where you can really create networks, create impact is really valuable. So with that, I'd love to say thank you to Samia, but also thank you for listening.
Thank you to all our 4 speakers. I'm just standing up, so are we going to get right on the screen? So, oh, brilliant, fabulous. So now we have our 4 speakers. I just step out of the way. The floor is open for questions, but while you're all thinking your thoughts, I'd like to ask each one of you to reflect on the following. I mean, there's some really powerful themes. You are 4 fabulously powerful speakers, so thank you very much. But in your themes, there was it's not just about arithmetic. It's not just a matter of numbers. There are a lot of women in education, in the civil service, in the civil society organizations, in the legal system. They're there. They're visible. But their visibility does not seem to be adequate to actually allow them to be agents of change. This seems to be because of the modus operandi of these institutions themselves. They regard particular ways and social norms as being appropriate, and women find themselves at odds with that, even if they're trained, whether it's in the civil service or as lawyers or as advocates or in policy making. Could you give us a moment in your own lives or in the work that you've done where you found maybe women have other ways of engaging? I don't mean women against men, but I mean as a group who was thinking about gender equality is not arithmetic equality, but it's a different way of doing the work. Would it be possible for each of you to provide an example of that? Because there was a lot of richness in what you gave, but we'd like to know more. So maybe I'll start with Cynthia. Cynthia, if you'd like to speak. We know it's very late, so thank you for staying on, but maybe you'd like to go first.
A specific example. I'm trying to think.
Or a moment in your work.
I think it was quite frequently actually. The best bosses I've had have always been women, including my dissertation supervisor across all across my professional life. The best bosses were women. But I think in sort of what really comes to mind is what I was doing, sort of court reform work in UNDP, and for various accidental reasons, this was the democracy and governance cluster, and my immediate boss was who was in charge of the governance sector was a female, and so any crisis, anytime, and if anyone's familiar with the bureaucracy of UN organizations, it's insurmountable. But when you wanted anything done, you get the women to do them. And so it was just made possible to kind of jump through the red tapes through her. And also, I think also to encourage, there were moments where we really had to put our foot down because of representation of female judges in the events that we were holding. I mean, it's still, this was about a decade ago, and I'm still in disbelief with the amount of times we had to emphasize that we needed more female participation and that this was a UN event. And the only way to do that was that it had to percolate all the way up to the top bosses, and then they had to say, no, you have to include female judges in the events. So I think that has been my experience across the board.
Thank you, Cynthia.
But I have other thoughts. I have other thoughts on what some of the panelists said, but I can totally come back. Yeah.
You can ask them now if you want, or would you like to wait? Is that okay?
I'll wait.
Okay. Yeah, because you said women are not helping each other in civil service. Tell us why.
Well, so yes, I'll begin by saying that I can't actually distill my experience into saying that I had better male bosses or better female bosses, but I can say that I had people who had certain beliefs, who were kinder, more professional and accepting of women in the civil service, and they were either men or women. And then there were people with another set of beliefs who were unfriendly, and they could be men or women also. So for me, the binary is not based on gender. But the other thing that I found was that not only a woman, but I'm also an introvert. So for me, where in a culture where women are meant to be sort of, talkative and just put you at ease. So for me to be in that particular role, I was really not, I think, matching up to the social expectation of what a female civil servant was supposed to do or be like. And it's actually something that my father told me, who was also a former civil servant, and he knew my personality. He actually told me that anytime you have an objection or you don't like something that's happening or you find it problematic officially, never sort of have an argument in person, but just note down your objections on the file or document it. And I think that really helped me find my voice and values in the system. And it actually also really petrified some of, the people that I was kind of sending these lists to, because they were used to kind of suppressing women by just being aggressive in person or just, intimidating them. And I'm just not someone who can respond in that way. But I did know the laws and the rules, and it really helped me that I focused on building my own knowledge and expertise. And I expressed myself in the way that I knew how to. And I think that has been the way. And it's something that, my father guided me, a female senior boss guided, but there have been different people who have helped me find this mindset. But there is, I think, in general, there is a tolerance of women in the civil service, but that tolerance is for women who are civil servants but don't upset some of the dynamics, or who are compliant generally, who are people who will not raise objections and who will be happy that they're just there. And I was just not one of them. So
absolutely in different moments. So
yeah.
Dr. Farid spoke about the job was important enough that the women broke the barrier and said, we have to do this. So in your case, somebody said to you, you've got to survive, so use a different strategy. So what I'm saying is the moment where you discover there could be other strategies. So thank you very much for sharing that.
Look, this is actually really helpful even for me to hear, because I agree with you that it's not always gendered who the ally is. I think in the Law Commission experience, because in Verma Commission, I really did feel like the team was everyone was an ally. But in the Law Commission, I think the chairperson was very sort of, receptive to a lot of the suggestions, but the rest of the team was not. And I was somehow the only woman in a lot of these consultations on family law. And I was not an introvert. So that didn't match my age or gender on that table. So that was a tough thing to navigate, because everything I would say, even if I would say it in the most sort of objective manner, it would sound more offensive to the man who's sort of, older than me. And that age dynamic became really, really pronounced. And I was mistaken for an intern multiple times. But I think what was really interesting to me in terms of strategies was that when we held these consultations in the Law Commission, we would call a particular sort of women's group, which has been petitioning before court also and has been sending us their, sort of writings and their, suggestions and so on and so forth. And they would be women. And with the group, we would outnumber the men. So then there would be like 5 women on the table we are consulting, plus me and 4 men. So the 4 men and me were the constant in the consultations, but everyone we invited had to be women, because again, Indian law, all the institutions really try to sound pro-women. So it was all about, we're trying to be inclusive, but it did have one problem as a consequence. We did manage to have a lot of women, and then they said a lot of things. And to be fair, the Law Commission report then ultimately does go against government policy to say that we don't want a uniform civil code. We want to codify personal law separately. But the one sort of casualty to that was the trans conversation, because then it became so structured around women and women power, and also the whole trope of Nari Shakti, which is women's power in India, which is so pronounced that it meant that the LGBTQIA, that chapter didn't make it into the report, because it became about, with women you can outnumber and then you can have that conversation, but with the minute it became a conversations about gendered others, it just didn't have the same kind of, it didn't have the same moral force before the commission. It just didn't work as a, we couldn't include that, because I was very clearly sort of outnumbered on that. And even in terms of the consultations we held, this is something I've also realized about the Indian women's movement. And this is the last thing I'll say. In the Verma Commission, they held a 3-day-long consultation where a whole bunch of NGOs were coming and speaking to the three members of the commission, when we were just kind of like sitting there taking notes. They did one thing where they said that the victim should be gender neutral, because sexual assault can happen to anyone. And then they said that, should the perpetrator also be gender neutral? And in one voice, all women's organizations really, really opposed that. So because that conversation then really became about, no, there are certain specific discriminations that accrue to you because of the cultural experience of being a woman, which of course allowed women to speak in one voice, but we know that the category of women has collapsed in the face of diversity of women's experiences. So it actually did not include a lot of conversations around hijra communities, transgender rights, and all of that. So the women's movement is a very powerful voice, and to a great extent, they can always have a seat on the table, but the Indian women's movement does not speak in one voice.
That's very helpful to know, and therefore there is a huge amount of work still to be done.
Yes.
That difference and diversity, and they're not the same thing. Ellen.
I think I kind of sit between the both of you. I'm fairly an introvert, but when I'm speaking, for my job, I'm able to speak directly. And I think there are, like you said, a lot of cultural connotations around like what it means to speak directly, to say your opinion. When I'm in Sri Lanka and I'm with other Tamil women, there's definitely a very strong sense of collaboration. I think I've had just the best experiences working with women in Jaffna who are outspoken like me. Culturally, I think that's normal for Tamil women to be outspoken and direct. But I think for me, the challenges are mostly about between different religions or different ethnicities. If I'm a Tamil woman in Colombo, it becomes a lot harder. I'm not recognized as being someone who can speak. And if I did, as I mentioned earlier, there are lots of levels of nuances to what your identity is in the broader national picture. So I also experience how perhaps women may not always be supportive of another woman. But I do think that overall I've had quite a fantastic experience working with women.
Thank you very much, and thank you for bringing in your personal moments. It's really very illuminating for us to think through what you've done, and maybe we just put our hands together first. Thank you. It's powerful that you were given of yourself, so thank you very much. Audience, Mariam.
I think that was a very nice presentation. It was great too. I'm very loud. So it just reminded me. So it just reminded me of my PhD I did with Shaila, and we have a publication on exactly the same thing that you were talking about, gender neutrality and the Pakistani bureaucracy. And we talked about glass ceilings and triple burdens and everything that you have said. I interviewed a lot of female bureaucrats and they reported. So I was just thinking things are actually regressing. And in talking about gender-based violence that you talked about, 6 years ago, I did a project in Pakistan, and on which another one, I and Shala have a joint publication. Pakistan was then the 6th most dangerous country in the world for women. And this year, it has become 2nd most dangerous country in the world for women. So my question to you is, like, I can ask you 10 questions.
Only one, Mariam.
Is it situation, it's getting bad, it's regressing, or is it just more, things are getting documented more? And is it worse? Because I'm working on unlearning social norms as a project.
Okay.
So after listening to your thing, I think we should do this project the most in the government. So the question is it worse to be working as a bureaucrat in the government as compared to, say, the private sector? Or are there most embedded social norms there?
I haven't worked in the private sector in Pakistan, but from what I hear from friends who are in the corporate world and so on, I actually think women in government have a better deal because at least our jobs are permanent. So no particular boss can weigh down so heavily on us that we feel threatened for losing our job altogether. Whereas in the corporate sector, that is a real fear. So women may actually adjust their actions accordingly. There are also lots of, so I did not mean to come across as overly negative, but I am critical, and I think there's a lot to be done. I think when it comes to sort of just encouraging women to be in the civil service, there are certain sort of reforms that could be more creative, that could be more imaginative than to just have reports and events in 5-star hotels and that kind of very circular conversation with the same faces, the same people. So I tried to do this in whatever position that I held, but to actually go out there. So I remember once when I was posted in Jhelum and we had this dispute between two different villages. And I went there to adjudicate and to find out on the ground what the problem really was. And all the men from the two villages had gathered in this central part, whatever the public square type of place was. And they were all around me, and the two camps were sitting. But I had studied the documents before actually going out there, and I knew there were a lot of female owners of land there as well. So I asked them that. That where are the where are the female landholders and landowners, and I would like them to be part of this conversation because they're as much owners of the property that we are going to be talking about. And they said, but the women never come to this spot, they never come to this place. And I said, well, why not? And I want to hear from them too. And they were very reluctant. My own staff was sort of whispering that, please, this will just offend them. And I said, but no, they are owners of the land that we're going to be talking about. And I want to hear from them. And I became a little stubborn. And I just said, well, I'm not going to start the conversation till we get some women out here. And then they came. And the women actually did have views. And they did give me a perspective that maybe I would not have gotten from the main audience only. So I think there is a real need to really go beyond the convenience of, which is important as well, the awareness campaigns and the posters and the social media things that are getting more and more common, but to actually think of ways that we get some real women, give them opportunities, and really try to include them and also update our beliefs. I mean, I can go on forever about the negative social beliefs that women have about each other. So it's a real thing, and it's very unfortunate. So yeah.
I apologize. I was trying to look for questions from online, and
Okay.
that whole thing didn't work. So I'm going to look at Julian to tell me how to make it not do that. So I'm really sorry, but thank you very much, and thank you for your question, Mariam. Are there other questions that are there? And Julian, please tell me if there are any questions online. I'm happy to take questions from the room while we wait for that. Or comments that you might have. And I am aware that there's comments that Cynthia has for the other panelists. So Cynthia, go for it, since they're still formulating their thoughts here.
Okay, so I think before I share those thoughts, just quickly in terms of personal incident, actually something just popped into my memory that I'd failed to mention is that, and some of what the other panelists said, is the amount of negotiation you need to do to select what aspect of your credentials you want to present that day in that room. So in terms of court, for example, I had an incident in court about a decade ago. I went to represent a client. It was very straightforward. I wasn't even speaking. I was literally standing at the bench with a group of lawyers, and it was the first item on the list, and the discussion suddenly descended into my attire. So it was the judges kind of picking on me on what I was wearing. The court, I think I was there were two lawyers in the room. I was one of two. There were about 40 or 50 people in the audience, right? So, it was sort of a moment of cringe where you suddenly feel that the entire room is suddenly looking at what you're wearing. And so, I had to step up. The judges were wrong, okay, in what they were saying. The point, I'm not going to get into the details, but I had to apologize so that they stopped talking about what I was wearing, right? So that's one aspect of the negotiation. I was absolutely livid when I left the court. And I knew some judges in the higher courts. And so I was like, that's it. I'm going to write a petition to the Chief Justice. This is absolutely unconscionable. And so one thing that we have amongst lawyers is that you should never be the advocate for your own cause. And then I had no supporters. Like, I had a very senior justice basically say to me that, sure, Cynthia, you can take this up, but let me tell you, when it comes to discussions about attire, none of the female judges will support you. And so that was the end of the discussion. And I had to pick my battle. And I was like, okay, I can take this up, but then there's going to be a magnifying glass on sort of what I do and what I wear, which is not where I want the discussion to go. So this is another instance of sort of, where you have to pick where your support lies and you have to navigate the field accordingly. Right, so which now brings me to my thoughts on what I was thinking of when the panelists were speaking. So one thing that came across was tokenism. So quotas in parliament. So Bangladesh, for example, has 50 unelected female MPs, right? So it brings women into parliament, but they have no power. So it's literally a case of selection. And this has been contested. A case was filed not several years ago, kind of sort of challenging the quotas. But anyway, the quotas remained. The other thing was capital punishment for rape. Bangladesh also sort of jumped into that race. And, one of the effects is, one is tokenism. The other is that it de-radicalizes dissent. There were lots of protests. And so this was a quick win and everyone was happy. Well, actually, women's groups were not, but it sort of, the public was sort of satisfied. The other thing, so that brings me to the thought that, the existence of authoritarian regimes, even within ostensibly democratic nation states, right? Within enclaves like institutions, legal institutions, and social spaces. And there's something to be said about the gendered impact of these spaces, which are essentially gate-kept. That could be sort of gatekeeping through familial legacies, right? As you have in the legal professions, or in other ways, depending on, perhaps foreign degrees. The other thing is that policy agendas are still set by global North institutions. You have terminologies like mainstreaming gender. Sometimes I think, what is that? Did the men suddenly find out that women are human beings? Do we have to reintroduce them to women? But when it comes to formulating policies for parity and economic rights, there's usually complete silence. Labor participation of women and microcredit, for instance, which empower women, are heralded as major achievements for Bangladesh. IMF is now very active in the region, including Bangladesh, bailing banks out, but not borrowers. And without considering gendered impact on borrowers and basically decision-making powers of women. So I guess my question to the panel is really a comment, not really a question, is more to do with what their thoughts are on the operation of authoritarian or enclaves of authoritarianism in institutions and how they've navigated that, or what their thoughts are in their experience of working in policy. Thank you.
Cynthia, that was both a fabulous set of comments and a great set of questions. Panel, anyone who wants to kick off on that?
I can say something.
Go on, Tanya.
So I can talk about just generally how much regime change impacts institutions and how that changes in terms of like the rhetoric around reform. So in Lucknow, I was working with this particular police helpline, which was called the Women's Power Line. So they very categorically did not use the word helpline. They called it the power line. And this was meant to be a pre-police intervention initiative by the police, where women could simply just address the crime of stalking or unsolicited phone calls and that sort of harassment. And the police would respond by, a woman would receive this call so that women are more comfortable talking, and a man would call the potential perpetrator of violence. So this was done pre the registration of a first information report, pre the FIR. So this worked as a fairly good initiative in the sense that a lot of women hesitated before filing FIRs and so on and so forth. But the reason I speak about this initiative is that this was instituted by Samajwadi Party, which was then in government in UP, in Uttar Pradesh. And this government was replaced by, in 2017, the Hindu majoritarian party, the BJP. And with that came, a different kind of rhetoric as well. So over and above the women's power line, they introduced something called the anti-Romeo squad. Now, Anti-Romeo Squad was all about basically picking up couples, particularly interreligious couples, because they were really suspicious about interreligious couples and Hindu women being married to Muslim men. The Anti-Romeo Squad was basically dedicated to policing young couples, particularly on Valentine's Day, so on and so forth. Now, this Anti-Romeo Squad got a lot of, this is kind of also how, sort of political rhetoric impacts small policy initiatives at a very local level. Now, these Anti-Romeo Squads were, of course, criticized in local newspapers and for the kind of harassment they were doing to couples. And then the power line and the Romeo Squad were merged, and it became Nari Suraksha Dal, which literally translates to Women's Protection Squad or Women's Protection Committee. Not committee really, but women's protection group. Now, the rhetoric changing from power line to protection is in itself a regressive step, which is again deeply informed by political ideologies and what their rhetoric is in their election manifestos and at the national level, that women need protection. They're vulnerable to sort of being lured by men of other religions. Again, this had a very sort of a majoritarian kind of rhetoric as well. But this is kind of how this is why I think a lot of women's initiatives and how they respond to the law. There's sometimes law is a sporadic ally of the women's movement, but sometimes they're also opposing state institutions, and that's how it's going to be, because all of these changes are historically contingent. So at this point in history, which is much more recent, we have a much more protectionist rhetoric because of the nature of the political party in power. So all of these things are influenced by political parties, by the moment in history, by global conversations, where the funding is coming from, so on and so forth. So this is how I think basically not just majoritarian regimes, but general political leanings impact ground level initiatives.
Any comments?
I can say about Sri Lanka, I think authoritarianism, of course, has a little bit more of a religious and ethnic connotation when it comes to the use of that word in Sri Lanka. And I think as minority women who are trying to influence any type of policy space under that type of a regime, it's really very difficult. You have to be able to transcend all those levels of cultural and organizational challenges that have been put before you in order to even be heard. And it also is geographic. A lot of the minorities live in the north and the east, and all of policy is set in Colombo, which is across the country. But the second you hit there, you're lost. You're just somebody who doesn't speak the language, someone who doesn't really understand necessarily the majoritarian norms, you get swept away. And you're constantly also hit by these narratives that the authoritarianism over the decades have put forward, which is that, you should learn Sinhalese, you should learn how to behave in these settings, you should learn to stand up when you see a Buddha depiction, these are things that you may not have been exposed to growing up, you may not be aware of, but when you try to participate in a public forum, you're immediately sidelined for not understanding the tones of authoritarianism that are, assumed by others. So I think it can be really difficult, and I think using the word authoritarianism in these policy contexts is really important as well. So I think that's a really great comment.
I just have two things that I would like to say. The first is that I think in Pakistan, at least, the parliamentarians and the legislature and even the senior bureaucracy, they're quite accepting of women. Women are very much present in the donor and policy circles also. So I don't think that is so much a problem there. Over there, the women are represented. They do have a voice. They also have fairly decent working conditions also. But there is also a class element. So the same women will also have underage maids or help who will be treated very poorly. There have been fairly high profile cases also where wives of senior officers have literally themselves beaten their house help, who are also women. And there has been So basically, when it comes to how a woman is treated, it also depends on where she is in the social hierarchy. And that's true for the bureaucracy as well. So in the elite services, you know your position and you have a certain level of authority and power built into the role. But women in the clerical staff, they are very hesitant. You can just tell from their body language how uncomfortable they are and how they'll always be dressed in abayas or the most conservative form of clothing because they're harassed when they come to work, they're harassed when they go back, they're uncomfortable where they're sitting. It's very easy to sort of make them feel unwelcome. And also, the women who are approaching these public offices for very menial tasks. So there is one case which has stayed with me because it was just so idiotic and so silly. There was a woman who had been visiting a certain assistant commissioner's office for more than a decade. She had lost property that she had inherited from her parents. Her parents had passed away when she was a kid, and her brothers had papers which basically they told her that it said that you have gifted your share to us. And she had been coming to this office for ages and saying that, is there any way I can get some share in that property back? Because I didn't know I was signing it away, but they tell me that this is a legal document and there's no way that I can challenge it. So I thought this must be an extremely complicated case because if she's been coming for a decade and, I'll need, a great deal of time to actually navigate through and understand the details. So I told her that, okay, come on a Saturday when I have more time and I'll sit and look at, the matter. And she brought, everything that she had and she came and she was not a very educated woman. She was what we would call in Pakistan lower middle class. But I looked at her documents and it was something like this. She had a copy of what her brother said was the legal deed in which she had signed away her right to her parents' property. And as is the norm in government offices in Pakistan, every time you make any kind of official supplication to a government office, you attach a copy of your national identity card in the corner and, you just affix that. So I happened to glance at it and I saw that she was born in 1971. And then I looked at the legal deed and it was dated 1976. And I said, well, as a 5-year-old, I don't think you were legally competent to have, given away. But nobody, in 10 years, she had been coming with those same papers. She had met God knows how many assistant commissioners. And people had just told her, oh, this is back to the 70s. Oh, how can we fix this now? And, you should have been careful. I said, no, this is very easily undone. But, it was just the fact that she couldn't believe me. I said, were you born in 1960? She said, yeah, that's my aunt. I said, well, okay, then you don't have a problem at all because we can fix this. But it's just that, nobody had thought to help her. Nobody, even within her family or in any of the offices, but she had gone everywhere that she could think of to, find any way that, somebody could guide her or find a legal solution. So it's just that, you just have to keep your eyes open and really watch out for the women who you might not immediately relate to, but who have problems, and they're problems that sometimes can be solved quite easily.
Well, that's a nice part of the story. Thank you for telling us that. Really affirming. Thank you very much. Do you have questions for Cynthia, since she did get a chance? If anyone has questions for Cynthia, if you're up to answering a question, I'm just checking that the panel has any questions, comments you'd like to add, just in case. Just want to allow the flow to go both ways. No? Comfortable? Please.
Yeah. I guess to Cynthia and Shamla, since you spoke a little bit about the development sector and civil society, there is this sense in civil society, I think broadly across the world, that there is shrinking civic space, that there isn't as much space to contribute in the context of authoritarian governments, and anything that you have to say that is critical of the government could bring on clamping down action in the form of either financial allegations or criminalization even. Do you think that there are pathways left for civil society to contribute to policy and law, or is it a shrinking civic space?
Does Cynthia want to go first?
Cynthia, do you want to go first? Is it a shrinking civic space, or is there hope?
In the context of Bangladesh and also elsewhere, I think it's a general trend, right? I mean, there are now more authoritarian states than democratic ones across the board, and that space is certainly shrinking. Specifically in the context of Bangladesh, however, one thing is that we had so we've had obviously waves of authoritarian rule and then democratic rule, and so it was interchangeable until 2009, and since then we've had the same party in power for a long time. One of the things that happened in the kind of interim period when there was a 2-year coup is that there was a civil society-backed military caretaker government, or a military-backed civil society-supported caretaker government for the 2 years before an election was held. So sort of in hindsight, looking back, the civil society lost some of its credibility. It's often perceived, or at least now the government, when there's an argument that, well, there needs to be more space for civil society. One of the arguments that's advanced is that, well, civil society had political ambitions, and that cannot be allowed, right? And so I think there's two ways of arguing this. One is that, yes, I think because the civil society was right in the middle of politics, as opposed to driving policy, it did lose some credibility. And this happens with the judiciary all the time. Like, the judiciary's been in mainstream politics. And so then it does tend to lose a little bit of its legitimacy. But at the same time, there is most definitely, I mean, we have a digital security law now, which absolutely directly affects civic space. Anything you post on Facebook, there are people that are in jail for liking things on social media, right? And that law is now being reformed to make it even more stronger against civic space. So I think it's a two-way street, and certainly, but now there's also no option. So in the context of Bangladesh, our elections are extremely protracted, and there's a deadlock, and we don't know what's going to happen in the next election. And so in this current space, who becomes the mediator? So neither party is willing to budge. There's no one to speak in the middle, and if you speak in the middle, you can end up in prison for things that you say. So that's just the state of things. I guess I'm not answering your question directly, but I can only comment with how things are on the ground. And to be honest, right now, there's very few lights we see very few light at the end of the tunnel. I don't know what's going to happen. I have my fingers crossed as much as anyone else. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. No, clearly things are changing, civil spaces are shrinking, and there is concern. Samya?
Yeah, I do think that the civil space is shrinking, and I think it's quite directly linked with the political establishment in India. And I say this because when the Verma Commission report came out, of course, it was critical of almost everything that the then government was doing. And if you remember, 2012, 2013 is also a very civil society moment in India, with Anna Hazare, with anti-corruption movements. So it was really when civil society was speaking, and criticisms of the government were extremely pronounced in newspapers and everywhere. Now, when the Law Commission report came out, this is 2018, it recommended against a uniform civil code. And for 3 years after that, there was no Law Commission formed, which has never happened in India's post-independent history, because Law Commission formation is almost an automatic task, that the 21st will end and the 22nd will come into being. But the 22nd did not come into being until 2022. And again, it's come up with the same mandate on which the previous Law Commission has already decided and conveyed that they do not, at least based on those recommendations, we do not want a uniform civil code. So the same question has been posed again to a different group of people who are also then, sort of determined by the government. So I'm not, I wouldn't be surprised now if the new commission does produce one. But at the same time, I also think that the civil society is beginning to occupy a slightly different space. Now, this has been happening in India since the public interest litigation began, which is when the courts really started absorbing a lot of the, civil society petitions, because public interest litigation was really about, public interest in that sense. And now what you see the courts doing is, for instance, something like uniform civil code, something like sedition, it's not going to parliament. It's coming in the form of petitions before court. The entire marriage equality conversation, it's taking the form of activism through courts, because courts at least provide, like Cynthia also said, it's a very performative space. They provide at least a space for staging a certain conversation. Now, this is not to say that the Supreme Court is really, an ally of the liberals here, because the Supreme Court is also very liberal in its observations, but conservative in its orders. So the operative part of the judgment will be very conservative, but there'll be, like 67, 49, 400, 300 pages of very liberal judgments. So triple talaq judgment was 298 pages. And the operative part of the order was one line, that triple talaq is hereby set aside. So I think courts are using this as an opportunity to put in what the advocates say, which is your civil society advocacy that is taking place in Supreme Court. They record these submissions, so it becomes a part of the judgment. But the operative part of the judgment remains very, very basic, and they're still towing a certain political line. So civil society activism is rooted more centrally through the judiciary. And while it had been happening since the PIL, I think that's become much more pronounced now, because the nature of Supreme Court petitions are also now, for instance, Nathuram Godse, did he really kill Gandhi? That became a petition that Supreme Court accepted. Kashmir 370, like before parliamentary intervention, it went through courts. So courts have become a way of also tempering some of the civil society activism so that the parliament doesn't have to deal with it. And in that sense, it's also contributing to how much the space has shrunk, because let's say the marriage equality judgment, the Supreme Court has already said that we can't do it. So in one sense, it's also taken the edge off Parliament to really intervene, because the activism is all contained in the courts.
Very much. Are there any? Yes, please.
I was just curious. Yeah. Thanks everyone for sharing your stories and journeys. So I'm just curious to learn a bit more about your personal kind of something that kept you going in the face of any kind of backlash that you face. So, I mean, we heard a lot about like curtailing from the courts, whether it is going into the communities or just trying to create space within the civil service sector. So what is it that kept you going? And I think it's for us who are here from like a perspective to actually do something maybe in the policy making space, or maybe not just become an activist. So it would just be like nice to hear something along those lines. Thanks.
Thank you. That's a brilliant question there at the end. Okay, so let's go backwards. Eliel, Samia, Atia, and then finally Cynthia. Thoughts about the moment that might help them to think about where they'd like to go?
I think definitely when you have a passion for something, for me, it's like really seeing justice when it comes to economic development. And then when you see that something you've done materializes, I think that passion really keeps it worth going. And along the way, you find women to work with who you just vibe with. And I think that's just a fantastic experience when you work together and you see something, reach fruition. It really gets you going.
I think I've given up in moments, in the sense that in the Law Commission, I had just come back from the UK, so I was very enthused about us, literally trying to contribute to new legislation. And it was quite harrowing, and there were too many pressures, so much so that I used to do a lot of this TV engagement at that point, because I was always about, representing the voice and, sort of getting it across to people. But it was really exhausting by the end of it. And the backlash was also a little tiring. And there were also fears associated with, how much can I really say? Should you be so public about, your views? Are you privileged or protected enough to be able to do this at the start of your career? So much so that I left the country. I came here for a postdoc after Law Commission, and now I think my engagement is a little bit more measured, in the sense that I would only now speak with policy where I really think I'm an expert and I'm in a certain position to actually have my voice heard rather than, fight all through. So, I mean, I'm back in academia now. So in one sense, policy conversations can be quite exhausting as well. And this is, of course, an incredibly safe space in which we can have this conversation. But I'm not sure how much of this I could say back home anymore, especially because these are very, very current, affairs and very, very current moments. So, but what keeps you going, I suppose, is that there is, of course, I mean, everyone's in it together. There are women in policy. It's not the lack of visibility, and it's a very sort of a shared struggle about negotiating that space and the power struggles that you face. So, I suppose that in itself is an incentive. And I do think in higher education and academia in India, there are so many women that's kind of dominating the intellectual space in a lot of ways. So there you feel very comfortable and relatively empowered because it's so dominated by left liberal academia, if one could put it this way. And that then just gives you some sort of a safe space to have these conversations and keeps you going.
Thank you so much. I think for me, it's two things. One is intellectual and one is personal. So my doctorate here was about institutions and institutional developments. I've been fascinated with bureaucracy and how bureaucrats think and work and act for a long time. So for me, just going back there and joining civil service was something very exciting. And it was also very, very enriching. And I got to know my country and its workings in a way that I could not have just as an academic. So I think that intellectual interest and curiosity has really been a mainstay. And also it has sort of disentangled me from some of the careerism and just some of the other issues that may be of more importance to people who are sort of just focused on the job. The second thing, I think that has come through in certain crises in which, particular office environments or particular situations where I had taken a stand on something and it was not going so well with, up the order. I think that has been my father. So I think in those cases, the advice that I got from the officers around me, my peers, other family members in the service and so on was always, well, why don't you just transfer yourself out? Because that's what people do, because instead of just hitting heads and, insisting on something. And they said that, well, this is just an official matter. Why are you taking it so seriously? You could just be doing something much more comfortable elsewhere. And I remember, one officer even said to me, well, right now, it's happening on letters and, kind of really ways in which I was made uncomfortable. My stationery was cut off, my tea supplies were cut off. Just in those ways, basically trying to drive me away. But then one of my friends said, well, the next step is that he's going to start humiliating you in public. And how will you react to that? And I hadn't considered the possibility at all. So I remember ringing up my dad and, just telling him what's going on. And he just said, that, you should just stay where you are. And otherwise you'll never really grow as an officer and this and that. But then I told him that, well, what if he humiliates me in public? And what do I do then? And he said, well, you humiliate him back. And then, so I think, yes. So then actually I stayed there and I actually became quite good friends with that boss because I actually saved his skin more than mine. Yeah, and he was very appreciative because that thing blew up in a month. Mm-hmm. And he said, well, you were right. I'm sorry, I gave you such a hard time, but...
I hope you gave some really nice tea on. Thank you so much. Cynthia, the final word's yours.
Thank you. So what keeps me going? I think, first of all, I think in South Asia, just everyday occurrences that happen, everyday inequalities, unless you don't read the newspapers, don't watch the news, and never come out of the house, I think it'll be very difficult to ignore. So I think what keeps me going is over time, kind of an appreciation of the impact that one's contributions could have. And it happened to me in a variety of ways. One was a sort of confrontation with my privilege. I think quite early on in my early 20s. You're aware of it, but sometimes it kind of comes and hits you in the face. And that happened to me sort of in my early 20s. I was working in a project where we had trained lawyers, and this was a project over 2 years. And we had trained lawyers, and we used to go literally with groups of lawyers in these really remote rural villages in Bangladesh. And the job of these lawyers wasn't litigation, but it was more legal consultation, sort of on the spot things that you could help women with. It was a women's access to justice program. And we also used to work with schools and kind of take these lawyers to schools, and they would speak and kind of try and inspire students. And one of the things that used to happen to me, so I used to have these women and these female students, really young students, and sometimes really sort of like older senior women, used to come and touch me. They would just come and sort of just touch my hand, or sometimes shoulders, or and so I used to always, it was all very strange, right? But then I had the phone call. So they used to call me, and sometimes it was just, hello, how are you doing? It's just that for them to fathom sort of a female lawyer, a highly educated female lawyer, it was an inspiration for them. And I used to go there. For me, it was a privilege to be amongst them, right? But then the reception I would get was this sort of, I was like, I haven't done anything to deserve this, this level of appreciation. But then when you start understanding the plights of these women locally, I'll just end with a really quick thing. We had a couple that came to a legal consultation. The man was crying, and his wife basically came and she hugged me and she said, please help me. He was angry, and he said like triple talaq to me, and he didn't really mean it. And the neighbors heard it, and the neighbors basically said, you two cannot be together. So then, the lawyers intervened. All it took was writing a letter. So it wasn't anything, no one needed to go to court. It was just local level mediation, which we helped them with. So then it was brought home to me, the advantages of being a lawyer. You can interlope between fields, right? So there are things you can do in the courts to influence policy, but you could also wear an academic hat. You could also wear a policy hat. And so I think that advantage of being a lawyer was brought home to me. So I think that's what really keeps me going, that I have multiple sites from which I could contribute and have an impact on some of these things that I care about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. And we've just come up to the hour, so we can put our hands together. Thank God for making it.
Thank you.
And if that hasn't inspired you, I don't know what will. It's absolutely fabulous. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much to everybody for some wonderful contributions. Can I just particularly thank the two people whose idea this was, Shailaja and Soumya. So thank you both very, very much.
Thank you. And Julie and I also want to take this moment to actually thank you, because intellectual forums kind of enable these conversations for us. So, and to Shailaja, thank you so much.
Can I just say on that note, we have a lot of other events coming up. The Intellectual Forum does lots of things. Please do come along. Our next event is actually part of a series we're doing about the legacy of slaveries from this college. So we have Hakim Adi talking about British history from the perspective of African and Caribbean people. We then have, well, all of these are relevant perhaps, but John Burko, the former Speaker of Parliament, coming here on the 10th to talk about his experiences there. We're looking at the Demerara uprising, again in the Caribbean as part of the legacy of slaveries. We've got Sheila Fitzpatrick speaking about displacement and memories of loss. We're talking about organic farming pioneers, the afterlives of Caribbean slavery, and the BBC Ross Atkins on the art of explanation. That takes me to the end of the coming month. So there's a lot more to come. Anyway, thank you very much again. Thanks for being here.